Hi, I'm Alia Ishak. This is the Green Beehive, where we host business leaders and experts from different industries to discuss the transition towards sustainability, providing you with insights and solutions from all sectors of business. Let's go over to Ed.
Thank you, Alia, and welcome everybody to the Green Beehive podcast. On this episode, we're talking with Michael Pottinger, predominantly about climate change and the shift in recent times in the attitude of businesses and governments as we come to accept that we can no longer stop climate change happening and instead we need to manage it. Okay, well, firstly, to say thank you, Michael, for coming on the podcast. Now, as I understand it, your role is that of an environmental consultant. Can you explain in a little bit more detail exactly what that means?
Well, first of all, I want to say hello to you and hi to all the listeners, and that I'm very happy to be here. About 25 years ago, I read a definition in some book, and it went something like, a consultant is one who has ideas on many things but has no authority to implement them. I thought that really captured it well. As oversimplified as it may be, I thought, well, that's about how I feel. I have been providing advice to businesses in the United States and Mexico, Central America, and Africa for over 30 years. But it's always been up to the managers and executives within those businesses to implement them.
What sort of companies, what sort of businesses and organizations use your expertise?
My career in particular has been really focused on consulting to private businesses. And over the 30 years, there's been a wide variety: oil and gas companies, manufacturing, chemical, pharmaceutical, mining, agrochemical. It's been a real wide variety of private industry sectors.
Obviously, when it comes to sustainability, the first thing that springs into people's mind is climate change and the threat of climate change. What risks do you see climate change presenting to business, to your clients in 2021?
Well, that's that is one of the questions of the day, isn't it? And there's a number of risks involved, and I think successful companies think long term and make the associated investments. I've spent a good part of my career helping companies identify environmental risks, especially as they pertain to soil and groundwater contamination. That was a large part of my career. And some companies could look at this type of investment as strictly coming off the bottom line. However, following the old adage of you cannot manage what you do not measure, getting a handle on environmental liabilities, as unpleasantly surprising as that sometimes was the first step in managing and ultimately reducing those liabilities. And I think climate change is similar. We have seen what effects the COVID pandemic has had on business. Look at the supply chain challenges affecting everything from cell phones to automobiles. And companies will need to look very closely at what risk climate change will present to their own supply chains, their manufacturing facilities, their distribution networks, their customers for that matter, in order to develop appropriate mitigation measures. The crippling of the mass transit system in New York City recently due to record-breaking rains comes to mind. Businesses are going to have to be prepared for these sort of events to occur more and more frequently. In other words, if preventing climate disruption from a humanitarian standpoint is not enough motivation, and it really should be, there's a whole host of cold, hard business reasons to care.
And has there been a shift in recent years, perhaps even just this year? You talked about the climate disasters that we've seen across the globe. Has there been a shift from a sense that there's an obligation to make these changes by organizations to one that has concerns about their bottom line, about profit?
There has. It used to be companies were concerned about environmental stewardship, which had a focus on such thing as water, soil, air pollution. Then came sustainability, which quite frankly had a wide variety of definitions, but came to include not only environment, but human resources. And this in turn morphed into ESG, or environment and social governance. But whatever the name, it's abundantly clear that the shareholders, governments, lenders, investors, NGOs are increasingly insisting that publicly traded companies measure their success not only by their financial bottom line, but also their environmental impact and ability to positively contribute to the quality of place that we call home, this third rock from the sun, Earth.
So, are all organizations equally engaged with the risks of environmental sustainability and climate impact? Is that universal?
I think that it is becoming virtually universal. It used to be that the oil and gas industry, because of its association with burning of fossil fuels and releasing of carbon, that they were the poster child, so to speak, of concerns about climate change. But now it's not only the contributors, but it's realizing that really all businesses need to be part of the solution because they are all going to be affected.
Why should businesses care about what, as you've described, is clearly a complicated and evolving issue?
That gets back to what I said before, where we've seen what the impact global disruptions have on companies, ranging from the supply chain networks to their distribution networks. It is affecting everybody. You look at the IPCC report of just a month or so ago. It isn't a question of is climate change happening? It isn't even a question of will we be able to prevent it? Now it's a question of how do we manage it? That is a stark statement indicating that all of us are going to be affected, whether we like it or not.
It feels, again, from somebody outside of the sustainability sector, that there's been a huge leap forward just in the last year in terms of that dawning realization of what you've just described, i.e., that it's going to be about management of climate change as opposed to prevention. How has the general philosophy within large companies, perhaps those you work with, towards environmental impact changed over, let's say, the last few years?
It's been uneven, depending on what sector the businesses are in, what their locations are. There's been this very staggered response to the pressures and growing realization. We have reached the point now where I think there is broader consensus. There's always going to be businesses and people who resist the realization, but it's increasingly obvious that this is something that's affecting all of us, and more businesses are now folding it into their business models, their risk registers. Climate is now showing up on that risk register. That is a step change from 5 years ago. It's on everyone's risk register now of what does climate change mean to us and what risks does it present and how do we position ourselves to manage those risks.
Okay, so companies are aware that changes need to happen and are happening. What further changes are needed if we are to achieve global net zero targets?
That's a good question. And there's a lot of really bright people applying their minds to that. And the short answer, I suppose, would be simply to reduce our carbon emissions and other gases like methane as individuals and as businesses and as a society. There seems to be consensus around that. The devil, of course, is in the details. Without going into specifics, it's going to take a combination of a variety of things. I think we can expect a new set of standards. One can only think that there will be pressure in the upcoming COP26 meetings to develop a set of standards and agreed upon processes for the implementation, enforcement, etc. But what these look like and whether there will be agreement, it's hard for me to say. I do think there will be more pressure than ever to reach agreement. But with that many players involved, it will no doubt be contentious. It will no doubt be complicated. And businesses will really have to make an investment to make sure they understand those implications. And speaking of investment, there's no question in my mind that I think most CEOs will look at that investment and see that it's needed to address the issues of climate change. And this investment will take many forms. They'll need to ensure they understand the requirements of the standards. They'll need to understand what demands are coming from other quarters, such as shareholders. The shareholders will be driving change, and also looking at local communities, be they customers or stakeholders around the manufacturing process. Speaking of local communities, it is seemingly well established that climate change will not impact everyone the same. The most vulnerable amongst us with the fewest resources to make adjustments to climate change will be affected the most. And I think any sustainable set of solutions will have to include an element of social justice to help protect those who will be affected the most.
Do you think that's going to be discussed at COP26? Are we going to see legislation around social justice and inequality in the face of climate change?
It will be part of the discussion, and it has been part of the discussion, especially recently. I think it's broadly recognized that that is an important element. Will there be an agreement? We are all hoping so. My clients, they do not fear additional regulation nearly as they worry about no agreement. Uncertainty about where this is going, which makes it hard for them to really get a management on their risks. They want to understand what risks there are to their business, and a clear set of regulations, a clear set of standards, an understanding of what the obligation is to local communities and those most vulnerable only serves businesses' best interests, much more so than ambiguity and lack of an agreement.
So the biggest danger is a lack of decisions.
A lack of clarity will lead to a lack of action, which will only exacerbate what IPCC has already said is happening. The window for us to prevent this is closed. The window for us to manage it is still open, and we need action while that window is still open.
And are the likes of your clients, large businesses, larger organizations, able to pressure governments for answers, for decisions?
I don't know that businesses all speak as one. You have different industries that will have different priorities. Everyone wants clarity. The realization is that the different sectors have certain different priorities. In my mind, we're depending on the business community to come to the table as much as we are governments to come to the table.
Inevitably, Michael, this has been a fairly somber conversation. You've talked about the requirement for leaders to make decisions. You've talked about the readiness, actually, of businesses to make changes and embrace new legislation and regulations. Is there an element of optimism? Are there areas of the management of climate change that you feel optimistic about?
It's a good question. And at heart, I'm an optimist because the alternative is just not very attractive. I think one can be optimistic that the stark reality of what we're facing will finally be enough to pressure governments and businesses to reach agreement and take actions that are necessary. It would have been lovely to have agreements before we've reached this point. In large degree, the Paris Agreement seemed to be a really big step in that direction, but we can see how quickly that can unravel with one election, such as in the United States, and the subsequent withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So I personally am cautiously optimistic simply because increasingly, I think more and more people are finding the alternatives just to be unacceptable and too risky.
Just as you mentioned Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Accord, are there governments that are taking a leadership role within this, not fight, as you say, but the management of climate change? Which governments are the most positive leaders?
Well, probably governments like Iceland. It's hard for me to pick out a major industrialized country that emerges as a real hero. It could be argued that maybe France is seemingly taking it more seriously than other countries, but the fact is, just about everyone has their share of actions which have helped and have hindered. I'm not sure I would hold up any as the one that has set the standard that we should all meet, with the exception of perhaps Iceland. The countries that we are most looking towards for leadership, they look at it perhaps as they have the most to lose in any agreement, but many of them are slowly turning around to think, well, they have the most to gain by reaching some sort of agreement that provides predictability and safety from the worst projections of impacts of climate change. The richest countries have the most to lose. The poorest countries are the most vulnerable. The richest countries really have the most to lose.
Michael, thank you so much for the chat, as sobering as it's been. And thank you everyone for listening to the podcast.
I'm Alia Ishak, CEO of Green If you'd like to find experts to help your business in any sphere within sustainability, please visit our platform at greenbeeinsights.com.